Making Bitcoin easy. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin as a currency. Okay, so we started off by talking about how if Bitcoin came in a box, we'd have computer code. But when we break it down further, that's not really that tangible. So if we were to open a box and take out other items, and we would see that Bitcoin is like six things. All right, Bitcoin's like a currency, like the dollars. It's like a mint that produces the currency. Something like a machine that prints out new currency. It's like a central bank that sends money back and forth to other banks and sets inflation rate for how much it increases, decreases, or decreases in value over time. It's like a wallet or bank account where you can store that currency and send it back and forth to other people. It's also like a payment network where it has a very wide network where it goes all the way across the world. It's on all the time. And it's also like it also is, I should say, a record of all transactions, what they call the blockchain. So it's a full history, you can call that a database or a book, but an open ledger online that you can see every transaction. To this day, you can see every transaction that Bitcoin's ever done. Okay, so it's those six things. And the first one we're starting with right now is Bitcoin as a currency. Before we jump in, I wanted to point out a problem that people have with Bitcoin because it's a little confusing, and that is when people use the word Bitcoin, sometimes they're referring to Bitcoin the currency, sometimes they're referring to Bitcoin the network. Sometimes when they're referring to the currency, they may say Bitcoins or Bitcoin singular or plural, so that can be a little confusing. Fortunately, context gives it away almost every time, so that's really, really helpful. I've found that the word Bitcoin can be used to refer to everything that's Bitcoin. So all the things I just mentioned, people would say, "Oh, so you're into Bitcoin?" They're referring to almost everything that is Bitcoin, all of those things, because it is six different things. Or they could be saying, "How many Bitcoin do you have?" Well, that specifically is asking you how much of the Bitcoin currency you have, not how much of the wallet or bank account or the transactions. It's talking about the currency part of Bitcoin. So they could be saying Bitcoin could also be referred to as Bitcoin the network. My Bitcoin's stuck right now. It's talking about how your Bitcoin is stuck on the Bitcoin network. You can say, I can't see my transaction on the blockchain. By blockchain, they're referring to the Bitcoin ledger, the Bitcoin history of all those transactions. And some might even say Bitcoin could refer to the entire cryptocurrency industry because Bitcoin started it all. The good thing about this is the more you learn, the more you hear these words, it's going to start to familiarize yourself with what is Bitcoin, why it matters, how it's used, and in the conversation that people have. And context gives it away almost every time. So in that example I just gave, how many Bitcoin do you have? We know that they're asking you how many Bitcoins, or how much that you've bought. And just a heads up, don't tell Bitcoin, don't tell Bitcoin. Don't tell people how much Bitcoin you have. I talk about that later in a section, do not talk about Bitcoin. So if you want to jump there and see what I mean by that, Bitcoin's going to be worth a lot of money someday, even more than now. So keep that in mind. Anyway, back to people using the name Bitcoin to mean different things. The context gives it away. So let's get back to Bitcoin as a currency. So Bitcoin as a currency, Satoshi, the founder of Bitcoin, his goal was to create a new digital currency to improve the e-commerce experience. And he did create that in such a way, but e-commerce hasn't fully transformed because of Bitcoin yet. It's still in beta in a lot of people's minds and my minds too. Now, what his creation did do, Bitcoin, was it created an entirely new currency that rivals the US dollar. You might be shocked to say there's no way it rivals the US dollar. And why would we even need a new currency? So let's go into that a little further. To see how Bitcoin as a currency matters and is improving the world and how it compares to the US dollar, we have to compare it really closely to how the dollar is, how it is and isn't, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this is interesting because how often have we ever done that? Before Bitcoin, I hadn't compared the dollar to any other currency. I didn't even know I had any other choice. Seriously, think about that. So when Bitcoin came along, it forced us to look at what we have and compare it. That's what freaks people out, the government, banks, is because they see that it's superior and they can't stop it. So let me show you how. When it comes to currencies, most people in their lifetimes will never think about, like I just said, comparing a different currency or using a different currency other than the ones their parents use or their grandparents or their great-grandparents. I mean, I'll probably go, well, not me, but my grandparents went through their whole lives only using the US dollar. Now, Europe switched to the euro about 20 years ago. Now, what that means is France, let's just use that country for example, they used to use a currency called francs, and Germany used to use something called Deutschmarks. Okay, but they don't use those. They use the euro. And I'm not going to go into all that, but there was a currency change in that place at that time, and it's still, going on. And what I've done is I've included a chart to show you a breakdown of how long history's most popular currencies have been used. Just the concept of a new currency is foreign. That's a new concept to almost everyone who's ever lived on Earth throughout human history. It doesn't happen often. There are exceptions when countries go through growing pains or wars, and it leads to some kind of revolution or turnover. And when this happens, the military general or leader, they write the history books, and they're people who, bring them into power or just accept them into power. They put their new leader's face, they stamp it on coins or currency. That's what we know. So it's what everyone does. The idea of creating a new currency will likely never cross someone's mind, and it rarely has. Conventional wisdom dictates that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And you could think that. Why even rock the boat? However, something interesting happened with the internet. As we evolved, as the internet emerged, almost all of human history suddenly became available to almost everyone in the world with just a few clicks of a button. And then you have the emergence of the internet with world-changing events like the banking crisis of 2008, and people start asking questions like, what's a bailout? You can print more money? They print more money? That much money? Is this going to happen again? What are we going to do? And then you show them a chart like this. And that's pretty concerning. It's pretty freaky when you realize that your currency isn't worth as much as you thought. Now you've got people's attention. And it actually fills in some of the gaps in our thinking, like, so is that why it was easier for my parents, or it seemed easier? Is that why my grandma talked about saving so much? Mine did all the time. Save, save, save. Is this why it seems like we can never get ahead, and I'm perpetually stuck with student loans and for one part of it? You're saying it always wasn't like this? No, the answer was it wasn't. As it relates to the dollar as a currency, the dollar used to go a lot further, and even more when we were backed by gold. And it wasn't just paper based on faith, fiat, okay, a government issued currency. We had gold. You could go in and exchange it for silver or gold. You can't do that now. But what's led to such a devaluing of the dollar over the past 100 years? Because that picture doesn't tell the whole story. The biggest answer to that, the reason is because of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is our country's central bank. So we talk about how Bitcoin is like a central bank, or it actually acts as a central bank. And we'll go into that in a future video soon. But the reason the dollar has devalued so much is because the US Federal Reserve's monetary policy of continually increasing inflation, how much that dollar decreases over time, and how much they've increased the money supply, how much they print more of it with a mint, I call it the mint, has destroyed the value of the dollar. And it's greatly hindered, if not totally destroyed, our chance of saving or getting ahead by that means. You probably haven't heard too much of the Federal Reserve. Maybe you heard about it when Ron Paul talked about it years ago, but it's important to know a few things about it, and we'll just stay on the surface. We're not going to talk about Jekyll Island or anything like that. But the Federal Reserve is the U.S.'s central bank. I just said that, and it was created in 1913 to help control the U.S. economy and prevent it from financial crises, or experiencing crises. So they said, strangely, it's not federal, and those in charge aren't elected, and it's not a reserve or a storehouse of money. That's just a fact. It's not federal and it's not a reserve. It's called the Federal Reserve. Furthermore, and this might get really uncomfortable, but I have a citation for this if you want to learn this. The US Federal Reserve is a collection of private global banks from all around the world. Citigroup and JP Morgan, London's HSBC Bank, Germany's Deutsche Bank, Japan's Mizuho Bank, and China's Industrial and Commercial Bank. Part of these banks manage our country's US dollar. Yes, other countries manage the monetary policy, the inflation rate, how much the money supply is for our dollar. So we're talking about how Bitcoin is like a currency, comparing it to the US dollar, which has devalued so much over time because of the Federal Reserve. The Fed aims to keep inflation between 2 to 4% a year, which means the US dollar decreases in value by 2 to 4% a year. And you might ask, well, why? I know I had that thought until I looked it up. And I was like, why would they do that? Why would they ever willingly devalue or decrease the value of the dollar? And the idea is that if you make it hurt a little bit to save, you'll spend more. You'll get rid of your dollars, which stimulates the economy, which prevents financial crises. And if you do it just a little bit, it's probably not that bad. But that's not the only thing they do, which I kind of disagree with, and I think we need to revisit it. Separate conversation. Fortunately, we have Bitcoin. But the Fed also tinkers with the money supply through something called quantitative easing. You may have heard that, QE. We first heard about it in the bailout in 2008, and then last year it was insane what they did. This is printing more money. QE, when you hear QE, just think printing more money. Did you know that last year, 20% of all US dollars in existence was created in 2020? Or how we printed more US dollars in 1 month last year than over 200 years before it? The reason behind this in general is simple. It's to move money through the economy where it's slowed down or stalled, kind of like a clog in a drain. It encourages lenders to lend more money to businesses, to do more things, do more projects, entrepreneurs to start more businesses, and also homeowners to buy more houses. That's the idea. But what if these banks don't lend money? What if they issue big bonuses? What if entrepreneurs aren't starting new businesses because they're scared? I'm not saying all of that happens all the time, but it does. There's no guarantee. The reason they printed so much money last year was because of COVID. All of those shutdowns that they did, how it already affected a kind of an unsteady, not great economy that was recovering from the 2008 crisis, that's why they did that. The problem with printing more money is it almost never ends well. In fact, I would say it never ends well. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. Anytime you increase the supply of something, the demand for it in a market decreases. That's just supply and demand. And the opposite is true. If there's less of something, the value for one increases. Think Beanie Babies or the Mona Lisa. Obviously very different, but same kind of principle. There's only so many of them. And people ascribe a lot of value to the Mona Lisa and Beanie Babies. Again, the idea is that if the economy grows enough to outpace the level of inflation or the devaluing of the dollar, then it's a win. It's a win for the economy. It's a win for us, the consumer, and we can go on with life. And this is also important because the US dollar is the global reserve currency. That's the currency that's the most often used, the most respected, or considered the number one around the world. And it's important because it's why the world and the global banks that make up the Federal Reserve allow the US to keep going with this policy. They continue to inflate, to print more money. It benefits them in some ways. This has to do with international trade and tariffs and trade deficits. Whole separate conversation, but that's what it applies to. However, in almost every case where a country has printed more money, it eventually destroyed the country. And not just the banking or the dollars, the entire country. Venezuela is one of the, I say, best examples, but it's such a sad, tragic example. So what are you supposed to do? So let's get back to Bitcoin. And around the time it was coincidentally introduced to the world, some timing, the world was just coming to grips with what happened in 2008 and the banking crisis and what that meant for their mortgage, their job, their dollars, their future. Enter Bitcoin, a new online digital currency with a set inflation rate, a fixed money supply. It was free to use. It was fairly fast. It was mostly private, and it was 100% secure and not subject to the whims of humans or governments or wars, and you don't need permission to use it. The playing field just levels. The world forever changes overnight. And if Satoshi would have used his real name and released Bitcoin through a company, this new financial revolution would have been stomped out as soon as it started. But Satoshi gave away this code, this currency, for free. As open source software, he remained anonymous and then he disappeared. And we all benefit and get to use it. And the future is so bright with so many possibilities. And this is one of the reasons there are so many cryptocurrencies now, because people see the potential. We never knew we needed a new currency until Bitcoin came along. Because it did that, it showed us the ugly side of the US dollar and fiat currency as a whole. And I don't know if Satoshi ever saw this coming, but Bitcoin hasn't come close to revolutionizing e-commerce yet, but it has shaken the financial world to its core, and central banking and countries around the world. What you do hear countries saying is them creating their own digital dollar. Why aren't they talking about using Bitcoin? Why aren't they talking about adopting Bitcoin? Nobody controls Bitcoin. Bitcoin is free, and you'll hear about that more as I explain it. If they can't control it, if they can't control how much is released, if they can't control the inflation, that's a big problem. It has to do with a lot of their agenda, and you could argue has to do with public policy. I say scrap a lot of the whole thing. Let's use Bitcoin. Let's compete. Let's have currencies compete and let the market decide. But you are not going to hear countries talk about adopting Bitcoin. But the funny thing that's been happening is over the last 10 years, there have been there's a Bitcoin Obituary website. I'll include a link to it where it talks about how Bitcoin has died. Oh, it died again. It's never going to recover. There's been so many of these announcements because of something that happened in the news, a country saying something about it. And guess what? It's still here. So they can either slow it down and make it so it's hard to cash out and make sure they're getting you with taxes, which you pay and I pay, or they're going to say, we'll talk about a digital dollar, but they can't stop Bitcoin as a currency. Everybody can use Bitcoin as a currency. Everybody can use it. We don't have to use the US dollar. So hopefully you're starting to get an idea of why Bitcoin as a currency is such a big deal. Now, we're not there yet. Do I use Bitcoin as a currency? No, I use dollars. Because frankly, if I used, and I talk about this later in my best practices, why I don't recommend using Bitcoin to buy and sell goods, but if I were to go and buy a coffee down the street with Bitcoin, first the place would have to accept it, and there are vendors who accept it. In the US, I'd have to pay taxes on the difference between what the Bitcoin I used, the cost basis for what I bought it for, and what the cost of it was, or the price of it when I paid for the coffee. So if it's appreciated in value, there's no way I can use Bitcoin as a currency in that way yet. And that's really frustrating. And we may never see that. We may never see that. Some people think that, and I wouldn't be surprised. That's one of the challenges I see, I talk about later, as kind of one of the threats to it are the countries and their response to it by laws and regulations. But here's the thing. It's 2021. Bitcoin is still here. It's still being used. It's not being killed. It's only slowed down a little bit. All right, so obviously you can see I get excited about this kind of thing. That was Bitcoin as a currency. Okay, next we're going to talk about Bitcoin as a mint. So let's just keep going. Hopefully you're excited, you're learning a lot, and we can learn more in just a second.